Traders, how are you? With Marcello. Today we're doing the recap of what happened in the markets last week. This week we have Amazon shares hitting a record high, Warren Buffett giving away over $5 billion, and we have good news on the inflation front. Let's go ahead and get started. Overall for the week, Amazon is now the fifth company to cross the $2 trillion valuation mark. Remember that market valuation is basically the value of all the shares outstanding in a lot of these companies. The stocks in the United States, mostly negative outside of the NASDAQ, which was the only positive. Canada also in North America was positive. One of the unusual things that started to happen since we have these huge, ginormous corporations in the stock market, there was a day this week where 70% of the shares in the NASDAQ were actually negative. But since we had these large corporations that I just mentioned to you guys, Microsoft and Nvidia and all these guys, the NASDAQ actually finished positive. So now the value, or what we see as positive or negative when it comes to the NASDAQ, really isn't a good representation of what the market is actually doing, due to the fact that we have this overweight big technology sector. Actually pretty interesting. Overseas market news: the European markets were mostly lower. Latin American markets were mixed. The biggest winner there was the Merval in Argentina. Remember, Argentina voted for the first libertarian president in history. He's actually doing pretty well. Middle East and Africa, mostly mixed. Egypt was the biggest winner there at over 5%. And then in the far East, Asia, Australia, that area, the markets were mixed, but we have the Philippines at over 4%, being the biggest winner of the week there. Bitcoin and crypto news: Robinhood, the brokerage firm, has decided to purchase the crypto exchange Bitstamp. If I'm not mistaken, it's not one of the largest, but it's still pretty big. And Bitcoin for the week is lower, down over 5%, just a touch over 61,000. And outside of that, we don't have a lot of other news in the crypto space, outside of the fact that, it hasn't really been moving that much recently, although it probably will as we get closer to the end of the year. The commodities and energy, according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, U.S. milk now is starting to get hit by the bird flu virus. Remember that the NIH and other parts of the government has been manipulating some of these viruses to make them more potent against us. I don't know if you guys remember, I talked about the permafrost. I believe it was in Russia and in other places. There's viruses that were stuck inside of the snow. And scientists actually harvested these viruses and they started messing with them to make them more powerful. It's kind of like they want another pandemic to happen on purpose to kind of lock us all down. Conspiracy. Just a conspiracy. Cilantro prices have risen over 400%, caused by a drought. In Mexico, cilantro is a huge part of their traditional dishes, so now a lot of Mexicans are looking to not include cilantro in their plates. Crude in the U.S. went up about 1% to $81.54. International crude, which is Brent, went down 0.28% to $85. And big news when it comes to gold: hasn't hit a record high or anything again yet, even though it did recently, but the World Gold Council surveyed 70 central banks, and 29% are expected to increase their exposure to gold in the next 12 months, while 81% are looking to increase over the next year. 2025, obviously. So even though it's been hovering around 2,350, what looks like is that there's going to be a lot of buying pressure, because when central banks start to buy, they don't buy a little bit, they buy a lot. And so that could push the gold to more record highs. Argentina is going to start producing 4 new lithium mines are going to go into operation. That's going to double the capacity production of Argentina, which is going to help. I do wonder what's going to happen to these batteries that are toxic for the environment after they expire in 15 years, 10 years. Where are they going to dump all this stuff? Hopefully it's in a safe place. It's not going to affect our health. Gold went up 0.22% to 2,327, while silver went down 1.26% to 29.18. In financial and banking news, the biggest hedge funds in the world, Citadel and BlackRock, are now looking to open up a new exchange, a new national stock exchange in Texas to compete with the New York Stock Exchange. Looks like they got a little bit tired of all that regulation and taxes. And as a result of Biden's inflation, average Americans have lost about a fifth of their purchasing power, probably a lot more. For those of you guys that know me, I haven't been to Five Guys yet here in the U.S., but during the pandemic 2020, I went to Five Guys, 2 people, 2 fries, 2 burgers, 2 drinks, $20. Now, when you go to my Five Guys, it's literally $25 for one person. So we literally have had 120% increase in the span of 4 years? That's 25% a year. So they tell us that the inflation rate is 3, 4, 5, 6, 7%. In reality, I'm sure all of you guys are seeing what's happening in the grocery store, right? And I'd be interested to know, what increase you guys have been seeing, before. If you spend, let's say, $200 a week or $300 a week on food, you're probably spending $500, $600 a week, right? So definitely not 3, 4, 5%. And speaking of Biden inflation, the political news, the presidential debate was this week, had an amazingly clear and energetic performance by both candidates. So I wish them both the best. Consumer sentiment fell to a 7-month low. Remember that the most important thing when it comes to the world economy, I would even say it like that, is consumer spending. In most of industrialized countries around the world, consumer spending is actually the biggest percentage of the economy. In the United States, for example, it's almost 70%, 70. In Germany, for example, it's almost 50%. Remember that Germany now is the third largest economy in the world. I don't know the exact number for Japan. I'll look it up here in a second so I can remember it. But Japan most likely is around 50% as well. And in the processed meat, the conspiracy theories, fake meat and other ultra-processed vegan food are linked to heart disease and early death. They did report, though, that eating actual real plant food, things like, leaves and grass and all that stuff that is natural, not ultra-processed, that comes in a box or has ingredients listed on it, is actually helpful. But any ultra-processed foods, things like soy, tofu, all that stuff is horrible. Consumer sentiment, as I mentioned, fell to a 7-month low. Moody's, which is a financial institution, is predicting that 24% of office towers are going to be vacant by 2026. This is a financial time bomb waiting to happen, since most of the financial industry loans for these office towers to be able to get built. So they're now expecting that a lot of these office landlords are going to receive $8 to $10 billion less than before. And there's going to be a property value destruction of $250 billion. So a lot of pensions, a lot of money from a lot of these big banks are all invested in a lot of these property towers, the office towers. So it's going to be quite a difficult situation where a lot of the value of these loans now have to be marked down. Imagine, for example, I remember a situation recently, actually. I think it was a tower in Philadelphia or Baltimore, but it sold at 10-20% of what the actual value is. So to put that into perspective, imagine that somebody takes out a loan from a bank at $100 million to build one of these towers. And then when they go to resell it a decade later, which is probably going to be now, they are only able to get, let's say, $20 million for it. That means that the bank has to write off 80% of the loan. And where are those losses coming from? Obviously, you see where I'm going with this, right? So there's a big situation that's kind of starting to accrue because people don't want to go back to work. And now the property values of a lot of these towers are going to come crashing down because nobody needs these towers anymore, essentially. The U.S. Congressional Budget Office is now expecting the federal government debt to increase by $2 trillion this year in 2024, or 6.7% of GDP. That's $400 billion higher than expected because this current administration can't stop spending money. $890 billion in federal debt interest in 2024. To put that into perspective, the federal budget, if I remember correctly, is about $4 or $5 trillion. So about 15 to 20% of the entire budget that we're paying in the United States is going just to pay the interest on the debt. And sorry if you guys can hear the dog. I'm traveling, had some problems with the microphone. But, I mean, just imagine if you and your personal finances, if you make, let's say $100,000 a year and 20% of your budget, 20% of the money you made is going to pay interest on your credit cards. Can you imagine the problem that you'd be in? French inflation slowed slightly in June. Italy's inflation rate continues to remain low. Spanish inflation cooled further in June as well. And on a cost-adjusted basis, California is now leaving the nation of the percentage of people living in poverty. And they even have 30% of the homelessness. The homeless people living on the street live in California. 30% of all the homeless people. California was once the birth of capitalism, let's say, and now that the communists are in charge, unfortunately, it's going down the rabbit hole. Political news, I mentioned the debates. And economic news, the U.S. Commerce Department is reporting that the same home sales that have already been built collapsed in May by over 11%. Remember that we have a situation where the interest rates are super, super high right now. So in order to afford the same house, which actually is valued higher now, which increases the monthly payment, the interest rates have actually gone up by almost 3 or 4 times what they were before. So now in order to buy the same home, which is actually valued a little bit higher, the monthly payment is going to be about 3 or 4 times what it used to be. So most people can't afford to buy a home anymore. And on top of that, there's a situation where we have all of these homeowners that refinance their mortgage loans at a 2, 3, 4% rate, and they're not selling because they know they can't go somewhere else to afford another house that's valued at higher than their house, and the monthly payment being 2, 3 times higher because of the interest rate. Corporate news, there's a retail bloodbath. Announcements already this year, about 2,600 store closings. Remember that the consumer spending is the most important number in the U.S. economy and global economy also, I would say. So 2,600 closings for stores means that the consumers aren't spending money anymore, which means that almost 70% of the U.S. economy isn't doing well. In the U.S. Department of Justice are they're reporting, according to a few sources, that the DOJ now is going to go after TikTok against the violating of the privacy rights of children. They're also trying to appeal the new law that was passed that ByteDance, the company that owns TikTok, has to divest their U.S. assets of TikTok as of January 19th, 2025, or they're going to be banned. Rivian, the truck and SUV electric car maker, surged 23% after Volkswagen, the second largest car company in the world, said that they were going to invest $5 billion. And Tesla went up almost 5% on the news that they're going to be revamping the Model 3 and Model Y and also starting production on their next-gen Model 2 vehicle. Really interesting, remember, because the Model Y is the best-selling car, not electric car, but the best-selling car in the world in 2023. Their shares are up over 11% the last 3 months, but they are down about 21% so far this year. But it seems to be they're doing pretty well so far. Walgreens fell over 22% after they missed the expectations of their revenue. They are cutting also their full year outlook. Remember that Walgreens is one of the biggest retail stores in the country. So again, that consumer spending, people are starting to pull back. Levi Strauss, the jean company that makes the pants, the jeans, they went down over 15% after they missed their expectations for the financial numbers and also lowered their expectations for this year. So you can see now company after company is not, they're starting to report the problems that they're starting to have with meeting their numbers because the consumer spending isn't out there with what it was before, let's say. Nike shares plummeted almost 20%, wiping out $2 billion in valuation. It was the worst session ever for the company. Their direct-to-consumer sales dropped 8% compared to the same quarter a year ago. They reduced their full-year outlook. Get ready to hearing that the next few years. The stock is down so far 31% in 2024. And remember, outside of the preppers are right. Remember, the economy is not doing as well as they're reporting. In the international events, police in Kenya fired upon demonstrators that were getting into the legislative building after they wanted to pass a bill increasing taxes due to the climate agenda. And also the Bolivian armed forces with the general tried to stage a coup, but he was failed essentially. And now the communist leader there is continuing to control the country. And an interesting fact this week, Warren Buffett on Friday donated the biggest donation to date, $5.3 billion in his company's Berkshire Hathaway shares to 5 different charities, including the one with Bill Gates. He still owns about $130 billion worth of stock in his company. So supposedly, he's going to be giving all that away. That's the news for this week, guys. Let me know if you guys have any questions. Don't forget to subscribe. And remember, the preppers were right. See you next week.